Hey guys, so I've got 13 minutes now. I've sat and deleted a load of stuff. Okay, so I'm just going to carry straight on. So this is, remember, where Jekyll is detailing how he makes all of the logistics to make sure that Edward Hyde can be part of his life. I'm on the very last sentence on the bottom of this page, by the way. I next drew up that will to which you so much objected, so that if anything befell me in the person of Dr. Jekyll, I could enter on that of Edward Hyde without pecuniary loss. So now we understand the will. And he says you, so I do feel very much like this statement of the case is to his lawyer, somebody who might have to stand up in a court case and defend him posthumously, so after death. So it's very clever of him to make sure that if he for some reason can't become Jekyll again, that he can still not lose any of his money that he's earned as Dr. Jekyll. And thus fortified, as I supposed on every side, I began to profit by the strange immunities of my position. So I've circled the word profit because profit is to benefit from the strange immunity. To be immune to something means that he's immune to the law. He can do whatever he likes. Now, he said that he thinks that he's sort of everything when he says, I supposed. Now, he goes on to talk in a moment a little bit more about how great it is. And then he realises that there was one thing he didn't think of, and that was the fact that Edward Hyde didn't have his own bank account. So when he's caught in the trampling of the girl situation, he has to write the cheque in the name of Henry Jekyll. So after that incident, he goes away and makes a bank account for Hyde so that if he ever were to be blackmailed again, it would appear to come from his own account and not from Jekyll. So he's trying not to connect Jekyll with Hyde. Anyway, I'll get to that bit in a minute. Men have before hired bravos to transact their crimes, while their own person and reputation sat under shelter. So it's quite normal for people to, well, when I say normal, I mean criminals, and, historically, for people to hire assassins or to hire contract killer, to hire somebody else to do the bad deed for you, okay? So that is a concept which is in literature, even in Macbeth, which we're going to do this year. Some of the murders Macbeth commits himself, but once he gets higher up in the hierarchy of it all, once he becomes king, he can't murder people himself because there's always people around him because he's king, so he hires somebody. So it's a concept that what Jekyll is trying to say here is that it's completely ordinary for people to try and distance themselves from the bad thing that they want to do by getting other people to do it. However, this is a whole new level because he's not just getting someone else to do it, he's doing it himself, but in the body of someone else, so he can absolutely get away with it. So it's like the ultimate. I was the first that ever did so for his pleasures. I was the first that could thus plod in the public eye with a load of genial respectability, and in a moment, like a schoolboy, strip off these lendings and spring headlong into the sea of liberty. I've highlighted that whole bit about plodding through the public eye with genial respectability, all the way up to that metaphor there of springing headlong into the sea of liberty. Please write down metaphor, please highlight that bit, and please could you put that on your Jekyll sheet. It's a really good metaphor to remember, to learn, because obviously the more you can talk about the writer's craft, that, name drop techniques like metaphor, the better for hitting the assessment objectives and things. But the fact he describes it as a springing headlong into a sea of liberty, that sounds like the most liberating thing you could ever do. It's a sense of freedom, and the fact the verb springing, it just feels like a freedom and a lightness of step that he's experiencing. But for me, in my impenetrable mantle, the safety was complete. Think of it, I did not even exist. Let me but escape into my laboratory door, give me but a second or two to mix and swallow the draught that I had always standing ready, and whatever he had done, Edward Hyde would pass away like the stain of breath upon a mirror, which I've also highlighted. So he's got the perfect alibi, that's what I've written just in the margin there. And there in his stead, quietly at home, trimming the midnight lamp in his study, a man who could afford to laugh at suspicion would be Henry Jekyll. The pleasures, which I made haste to seek in my disguise, were, as I have said, undignified. I would scarce use a harder term. Okay, so that's interesting. So he's saying that they were undignified, so they're not becoming of a Victorian gentleman. But he says at this point that he wouldn't use a harder term. So Henry Jekyll's pleasures were not great, and a doctor should not be imbibing in them, but they also weren't the worst thing that you could think of. But in the hands of Edward Hyde, they soon began to turn towards the monstrous. Please highlight monstrous. When I would come back from these excursions, I was often plunged into a kind of wonder at my vicarious depravity. Now, you'll see here, this is the bit I'm reading. I've got quite a lot of it highlighted. I don't know if you can see that. So from I was often plunged into a kind of wonder, I've got quite a lot of this highlighted here. This familiar that I called out of my own soul and sent forth alone to do his own good pleasure was a being inherently malign and villainous. His every act and thought centred on self, drinking pleasure with bestial avidity from the degree of torture to another, relentless like a man of stone. Henry Jekyll stood at times aghast before the acts of Edward Hyde, but the situation was apart from ordinary laws, and insidiously relaxed the grasp of conscience. It was Hyde, after all, and Hyde alone, that was guilty. Jekyll was no worse. He woke up again to his good qualities, seemingly unimpaired. He would even make haste where it was possible to undo the evil done by Hyde, and thus his conscience slumbered. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but in this last little bit, he has kind of slipped into referring to Hyde as I, and here he refers to Henry Jekyll in the third person as if he was the other one. So I do feel like there's some slippage here where he is already sensing that he was becoming unsure which one was his real self. Now, I do need to go back because there's some great language in this. Now, a familiar is an animal that a witch would have. So at the beginning of Macbeth, weird that this is twice in one session that I'm talking about Macbeth, but in Macbeth, in the very opening scene, they have a cat, and there's another animal, I can't remember what it is, but they're called Paddock and something else. But a witch has a familiar. It's usually a cat, but it can be any animal. Now, Henry Jekyll is describing Hyde as a familiar, something which belongs to him, and it kind of makes him seem evil, like a witch, some kind of sending out something evil into the world. So he says that I called out from my own soul and sent forth alone to do his good pleasure. Now, the problem is that by taking this sense of himself out and sending it out, he describes it as inherently malign and villainous. So there's nothing good about him. I've also highlighted the fact that every act and thought centred on self. Remember, he is essentially the id. What I appreciate that this theory had not actually been written yet by Freud. He was writing it pretty much at the same time, about the same society as Stevenson's writing. So if you were to write about it in an essay, you would need to acknowledge that whilst the theory had not been published, when it came out, it is essentially talking about the same problem that Stevenson is writing about. So Stevenson, without realising it, he wouldn't have used this terminology, but he was basically saying Hyde is the id. And if you just let your id do whatever it wants, whenever it wants, that's problematic. That's not how society works. So, centred on self, drinking pleasure with bestial avidity. To be avidly doing something means completely enthralled in it. And he talks about torturing others, and he was like a man of stone, so another good simile there. The other bit I've highlighted is that Henry Jekyll stood at times aghast before the acts of Edward Hyde. And yeah, so that's where he's talking about himself in the third person, as if it's not really him. And it was Hyde, it was Hyde who committed the crime. So Jekyll manages to tell himself that whilst he can try and fix it, he shouldn't really feel that guilty about it. So at the beginning, Jekyll is able to distance himself from Hyde, and he tells his own conscience that it's okay because one, I'll try and undo it if I can the next day, and two, it wasn't really me anyway, so it doesn't really count. And that's why that last line where it's at the end of that paragraph where it says, and thus his conscience slumbered, meaning slept. So I get the feeling that Henry Jekyll, when he's writing this, can see that he... I've got a frog in my throat. I've also got a dog barking downstairs, howling, which is really annoying. Yeah, so basically, I think the way that Henry Jekyll's writing it now is that he knows he should have felt more guilty about that, but he's trying to explain why Henry Jekyll didn't feel guilty about it. Because basically, he separated the two things, and he sent his familiar out to do his thing, and he disassociated himself from it. I would probably write disassociated himself from Hyde at this point. Okay. Into the details of the infamy at which I thus connived, for even now I can scarce grant that I committed it. I have no design of entering. So what he's saying is I'm not going to tell you all the terrible things that I did. I mean but to point out the warnings and the successive steps with which my chastisement approached. Okay, so this is the link to chapter 1. That's what I've got written there. Link to chapter 1. I met with one accident which, as it brought on no consequence, I shall no more than mention. An act of cruelty to a child aroused against me the anger of a passer-by, whom I recognised the other day in the person of your kinsman. the doctor and the child's family joined him. So he's talking about Enfield. So he's now recounting, from his point of view, what happened when Enfield caught him having trampled on the child. There were moments when I feared for my life, and at last, in order to pacify their too just resentment, Edward Hyde had to bring them to the door and pay them in a cheque drawn in the name of Henry Jekyll. But this danger was easily eliminated from the future by opening an account at another bank in the name of Edward Hyde himself, and when, by sloping my own hand backwards, so his handwriting, he just made it slightly opposite direction, not a great disguise, if I'm going to be honest, I had supplied my double with a signature. I thought I sat beyond the reach of fate. Please highlight that line. It's the fact you've got the word thought in there. He obviously isn't beyond the reach of fate. But at this point, he thinks to himself, well done me, so clever. Nearly got caught out there with the old trampling the child and being blackmailed kind of thing. But now I've got another bank account, totally fine. I also think it's quite telling that Jekyll doesn't want to go into details about all the horrible things he's done. He doesn't even say how bad he feels about this child or the situation here, and he doesn't go into details about it. The only reason he's telling us the story is to tell us that, nearly got caught out, but then I was sensible and I opened a bank account. So I think Henry Jekyll is trying to get us to feel for him. I think you have to decide for yourself whether you actually do feel sorry for him or not. I know how I feel about him, but I've read this book quite a lot of times. And I do change my mind every time I read it. And there's bits of it that I feel sorry for him for. But the way that he writes this, I don't think he realises, obviously as a character, Stevenson's done this on purpose, but it's almost like because he's quite self-absorbed as a character anyway, he can't see that he's actually not necessarily portraying himself in the best light. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. It's about to go on to the bit that kind of tells us what happened with Sir Danvers Carew, which is quite interesting because you get to see the flip side as to what it was that set him off or indeed not. So I'm going to stop there and I'll do another bit later. Okay, bye guys.